Water hits like a verdict. It runs down her hair, darkening the thrift blazer she chose on purpose. It beads on the floor and catches the lobby lights, a small, humiliating mirror. Around them, dozens of eyes shutter open and close like shutters, some curious, some complicit, most frozen. João Menezes stands an inch from her face, a smile that is all calculation. His hand is empty now. The plastic bucket rolls away, forgotten. "Get out of my sight," he says, the words flat and loud enough for everyone. Not a private rebuke, an exhibition. People laugh uneasily at first. Even the cardigan women at the cafe counter fumble their cups. A man in a suit tucks his phone away like a guilty animal. Someone clicks a camera and then covers their mouth as if sound itself might be evidence. She doesn't stumble. Her shoulders stay back. Her chest closes over the cold that runs through her bones, and her eyes find one face, Camilla's, then another, Donna Rosa's, and then the glass doors beyond which spring city life pours on, indifferent. It should sting. It does. Yet there is a steadiness beneath the pain, a slow, hard thing at the center of her that measures the moment. She lets the water mat her hair, streams follow the seam of the blazer. She does not cry out. She allows the scene to lock itself into the room. Witnesses, smirks, the echo of João's shoes against the marble. She records it the only way a person can when nothing else is available. In the angle of her jaw, in the small set of her hand, in the recognition that this image will exist now in other people's heads as truth of who she is to them. Someone finally steps forward. Luis. He looks like a man with rules. Neat hair, a security badge that hovers like a halo that never quite fits. He moves between them with the awkward authority of someone who works to keep things tidy. "Mr. Menezes, this is not acceptable," he says, voice low, enough to be heard but not to inflame. João's smile becomes a frown that slips back into arrogance like an old habit. Isabel lifts her chin. "I'm fine," she says, and it is the smallest lie she could tell. She's not fine. The water is freezing. Her cheeks burn from the indignity, not the cold. Her palms are damp where the blazer clings. But the damage she means to take is not to herself. She's taking it to build a case. She's taking it to see how the firm will move when the worst happens publicly. For a beat, no more than a breath, the building is a theater, and she has been performing a scene in which everyone else is cast. Security radios crackle. Someone calls HR. A cluster of employees mutters. A few watch through their hands. João straightens his tie, as if to say he has simply corrected someone who was in the wrong place. He has already begun the next story in his head. The one where he is the reasonable man who restored order. People want order, even when it is cruel. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to hear more true-to-life stories about justice and change. An hour earlier, she had left a penthouse that smelled faintly of sandalwood. A photograph on the hallway table caught morning light. A younger Isabel with a man whose laugh lines softened the edges of a rich face. The marble frame held a small brass plaque with Father Roberto Silva. She touched the edge of the glass with a thumb. The photograph was not for performance, it was a memory seam. Roberto had adopted her when she was 8, had taught her to read balance sheets and table manners in the same breath, had taught her to recognize people. He had taught her that power was a responsibility, not an ornament. He had liked to say things like, "You see the room, Isa, not the chair." He would have rolled his eyes at the thrift blazer she chose now. He would have understood why she'd take it anyway. She dressed down on purpose, scuffed flats, a blazer from a second-hand shop, hair pulled into an unconsidered knot. Isabel Silva had never been less visible. She took the elevator with a backpack and a face that asked for nothing, packed a name tag that said, "Temp Reception," and walked through revolving doors with the practiced anonymity of someone testing the threshold she had once been taught to command. The plan was modest and stubborn. Complaint after complaint had reached the president's desk in envelopes that smelled faintly of tea and fear. Small things kept surfacing, a manager's sarcastic reprimands that cut the air, a pattern of menial tasks for some, gliding promotions for others. HR had filed reports that went nowhere. Anonymous tips arrived and then withered. Roberto wanted a clear picture. No flattering versions, no polished reports. He wanted to know what the building felt like from the bottom. Isabel had told only 2 people that she would come in like this. Alexandra Dantas, the president's executive assistant who held keys to schedules and secrets, and Luis, the security head, who would be the person to maintain lawful oversight. Alexandre had agreed to grant Isabel limited access to internal files when needed, and Luis had promised discretion, a hard, careful promise made by a man unused to intimacy. João Menezes arrived to this building 3 years ago with a polished CV and an appetite for power. He made his calendars into statements. He made small people into invisible notches on his way to meetings. He liked to be sharp with speech, at the expense of gentle things. A Rolex flashed like a second face when he gestured. He had learned early how attention works. You own people's time by owning the floor they stand on. Camilla found Isabel on her first shift and blinked as if she had seen a ghost of herself. Camilla was 22, cautious around authority, quick with a smile that tried to be invisible. She had been hired as a receptionist after a long chain of temp positions and student nights. She knew the ways this office demanded small sacrifices, coffee runs at odd hours, the invisible tally of favors owed. Her loyalty was earnest, but brittle. She feared losing the job that was still a bridge to something else. When she watched João with people, her hands sometimes trembled on her phone. Donna Rosa sat at the second desk with a history worn into her posture. She had been a fixture longer than anyone kept their title. Her hands moved with the economy of someone who had memorized the rituals of forms and files. She had kept ledgers in the old way, penciled entries that matched the memory in her head. When things were small and silent, she noticed them. A name that kept circling a complaint, a file that had no paper trail. She kept a notebook in which she jotted the weather, the birthdays of the staff, and incidents in neat columns. The notebook fit into a drawer that had a small padlock. She kept her eyes soft, but her pen precise. Days had been a study in nearly invisible cruelties. João sent Isabel on errands no one else took. He asked to see her for tasks that read like scripts from a man rehearsed in humiliation. "Can you copy these forms, Isa? I don't trust anyone with this. Make sure the coffee in the executive kitchen is exactly 22 degrees. He called her temporary, in the voice some men used for furniture. There were jokes made at her expense in team huddles. There were sarcasms that traveled like filaments through the open plan, gathering support in a room where people were rewarded for not asking. She noticed patterns. João timed demonstrations of authority for when the floor was most full, when the new associates were at their desks and their eyes were hungry for instruction. He interrupted women more easily than men. He smiled condescendingly at answers that were competent. At times, it was as simple as modifying a schedule to inconvenience someone. "You work the reception for the 9 a.m. training," he would say, as if schedule were punishment. Isabel kept a different ledger. She logged the insults in her head, marking the time, the witnesses, the tone. Camilla caught one of these entries when Isabel dropped a pen. She bent and picked it up, fingers brushing a page filled with numbers and short notes. 7:12, 9:04, demanded water runs, 7:13, 11:30, public reprimand, restapler. Camilla looked at the notes with a tenderness that felt like danger. Someone keeping proof. Luis watched the cameras. He was a man who believed in processes. At first glance, the security room was a maze of screens, showing tidy squares of office life brightened by fluorescent light. The lobby, the corridors, the cafeteria. Luis read them the way other men read newspapers. He kept a file on irregular entries and on door propping. When the bucket incident happened, it flashed on his screen as a pixelated burst, water arcing across marble, and he felt his chest shrink at the failure of rules to prevent a thing he could anticipate. He had been suspicious of João for months, not about pettiness, but about movement. João's access logs showed late-night entries into areas where he had no legitimate reason to be. Vendor payments associated with projects João oversaw did not match the invoices. Luis had made a record of it in a cautious folder labeled Finance Flag. He had no legal training to prosecute fraud, but he knew enough to know when a pattern smelt wrong. He kept copies of badge swipes, of timestamps that overlapped with system accesses. He was waiting for corroboration before speaking aloud because he believed that accusations made without a case were wind that could scatter people's lives. Meanwhile, Isabel kept watching, allowing the cruelty to deepen to see the architecture of silence. She did not relish it. She protected her private self, the one who could pick up the phone and call Roberto and say, "Stop him." But she had promised a careful approach to a man who believed in measured change. From the very beginning, she had insisted that she would not use financial power as a cudgel. The company had to change because the rules were bad, not because she struck like a thunderbolt. She wanted systems to work. She wanted people like Camilla not to believe that indignity was part of the job. There was a scene in the break room 3 days before the bucket. João had cornered a junior analyst over a missed slide deck, and with the slow cruelty of someone who flays with words, had listed every minor failure the man had ever committed. People gathered to watch. Camilla stood near the doorway, fingers curled around a paper cup. She listened, face whitening, until finally the analyst stumbled away, humiliated, carrying his dignity like a misaligned suitcase. After he left, Camilla went to the copier and stole a glance at the bystander list Isabel made later. There was a small notation in Isabel's ledger, "Witness." No one spoke. Camilla had walked back to her desk and put her head down. Later that week, she slipped Isabel a note. "I saw it. I'll help." Donna Rosa's notebook grew thicker. She kept tiny margins of commentary, the date, what was said, who had been present. She had witnessed 100 small cruelties and watched them calcify into institutional features. She remembered when people used to hand in complaints and HR would conduct interviews. Lately, the interviews felt perfunctory, like the checking off of boxes. She had spoken quietly to Camilla about the feeling of being ignored. "They think we'll get used to it," she had murmured, but her pen continued to move. Isabel watched João perform authority like an actor. He was unafraid in public because his private life had been smoothing his ascent. She had been told in quiet rooms of the shell companies. She had been shown a ledger with names she did not know, payments that happened in thin lines and then disappeared. She waited, not because she liked watching the cruelty grow, but because she needed to prove the pattern, not a single outrage, but a system. The water in the lobby would have been that single outrage. It was more brutal because it was public, theatrical, slander disguised as correction. The staff watched as if clutching onto some perverse entertainment, a replay of power's old games. After the bucket rolled away, João found the path to his office. He wiped his hands on his trousers and padded down the hall with the predator's calm of a man who believed himself untouchable. Some people applauded in an awkward way. Some stepped away from Isabel, as if proximity could make them suspect. Camilla stayed by the reception desk, balancing the urge to run with the desire to do right. She was small and trembling and enormous in the measure of her courage. She had been the one to take a photo before Luis stepped between João and Isabel. The phone image lived in her gallery, a grainy, tight capture of water, of an eyebrow raised, of Isabel's jaw that said, with a blade edge of steadiness, "This is not who I am." Luis escorted João to a quiet meeting room later that afternoon. He left Isabel in the reception area, wrapped in a towel the building manager had fetched. HR came, a woman in a grey suit who spoke in corporate tones. "We will be investigating this." There were forms. There were the thin promises of confidentiality. Each phrase felt like paper that could be blown away in a gust. Isabel wrote down the names of the witnesses, the time, and the type of incident in her small ledger, the page now damp where water had splashed. That evening, in the security room, Luis replayed the footage. Frame by frame, he watched the arc of the bucket. He rewound the moment João reached out. There was hesitation there, a small theatrical pause, as if João wanted the maximal humiliation. Luis's fingers hovered over the desk, and then he pulled up João's access logs for the past 3 months. The cursor hovered over vendor payments tied to João's directorate, and then over an account name he didn't recognize. M&L Holdings, listed as a consulting vendor on a minor project. The amounts were small if taken alone, but multiplied, their sum curved like a shadow. He pulled up the badge swipes. João's card had appeared in the accounts room at 2:36 a.m. on a Tuesday when no one else logged in. The timestamps matched computer access to the finance server. Luis printed the pages as a man might print a prayer. He slid them into a folder and felt the heaviness of a thing that could not be ignored. Alexandra received a message later that evening on an encrypted line he alone maintained with the president's office. In the message, Luis wrote, "Potential finance irregularities. Possible connection to Director Menezes. Security footage attached. Suggest immediate review." Alexandra read the files, felt the strain of it like a rope around the back of his skull. He answered bluntly, "Bring me everything. No action without authorization. We observe. We don't act without corroboration." Isabel waited. She could have gone to the top, could have called everything loud and sudden and public. She had stayed because the thing she wanted to do was not to punish João for public embarrassment alone, but to undo a structure that allowed his cruelty to go unchallenged. She wanted to create a system where no one could turn cruelty into theater and call it management. Over the next days, João's behavior sharpened. He sensed danger in the air and reacted like a man who believes he can burn away the trace of his footprints. He began to test people harder. He made offhand comments about Camilla's competence that she felt in her bones. He criticized the cafeteria staff for dishes left on tables. He cancelled flexible work arrangements that benefited junior employees. When someone in the analytics team asked a question, he replied with a scorn that cut to the marrow. And then he made sure a supervisor heard him say it. Power, for him, was an instrument. For others, it was a cage. Isabel watched the pattern cohere the way an anatomist watches a body reveal its internal shape. She watched João escalate and watched people who once made jokes now bow heads and become smaller. She listened to whispers in the stairwell. She watched people take sides, not because they believed in someone's character, but because they feared the cost of opposing him. Her own presence continued to be a careful paradox. She had access when she asked for it. Alexandra provided her with spreadsheets that made numbers look like constellations, vendor names, code numbers, transfer lines. She studied them with an odd sort of hunger, the hunger of someone reading a foreign language until the grammar becomes readable. She used legitimate channels. Alexandra had opened a limited account view to her for audit purposes, a legal window into the company's books. She did not override permissions. She did not break protocol. What she found were threads. Payments to consultants who did not exist in any client list, reimbursements with no receipts on file, invoices that matched the handwriting of a known contractor, but routed to a different bank. Each line looked small until assembled. Together they whispered of a network that used the company's reporting structure to siphon funds. João's signature was on requisitions for services where no service could be found. It was negligence, if one were charitable. It was negligence too often to be accidental. Luis supplied the surveillance, camera timestamps juxtaposed with swipe records. Alexandre supplied the documents. Isabel supplied the context, the lived experience of people who had been cut down, and the photograph of the man who poured water on her. Together, they began to build what a case needs, not heat, but pattern. Word of investigation made its way through the building like a rumor of rain. People started to act as if a storm might come. They carried their belongings a little closer to their desks, swept their files into drawers. João felt watched. He tightened a smile into something brittle. He began to show cracks, a disgruntled email sent at midnight to a department head, a curt voicemail left for a vendor, a flash of temper that made even his allies hesitate. Camilla collected small things, an audio clip of João's outburst in a morning meeting, a short video of him berating an intern. She hid them in a folder on her phone labeled "For Later," a name that felt both cowardly and brave. Donna Rosa transcribed entries in her notebook, neat lines that formed the bones of testimony. Luis printed logs and kept them in a drawer that he had labeled "Confidential Executive." Each of these acts felt like a leak in a dam. Isabel began to see that the story was not simply João. It was the way the firm treated those at the edges. The company's hierarchy was an architecture designed by men who had never been hungry. Policies existed on paper, but were flexible in the hands of the right manager. There were no channels that people trusted. HR interviews had become boxes to check. Rewards favored those who knew how to bow and withdraw. At night, she walked past the boardroom and thought about what the room would feel like to a new chief executive who walked in without a report and simply asked, "Who is afraid here?" She had a list of reforms in her head: whistleblower protections, an independent review board, a publicly posted code of conduct with teeth. But reforms needed a spine of support. They needed people in whom employees could trust. That was why she had chosen to watch and to gather names, the names of those who would be part of the solution. There were moments, quiet and fragile, when she wondered if she had under or overestimated people's capacity for good. When she put the towel around her shoulders that first day, a janitor had met her eyes and said without a flinch, "You don't belong here like that." He meant to pity. She had said, "I'm doing this so no one else will have to." He had nodded as if he understood suffering, and then returned to his mop. Small, private affirmations, tiny alliances. In the quiet of one afternoon, Alexandra met Isabel in the stairwell, where the hum of air conditioning made confessions possible. He looked at her like a man who had seen the gears of the company and was not surprised by the rust. "You understand the danger," he said. "Even with proof, people will ask why the president allowed this to continue. They will ask why the president's daughter was in reception. We need the narrative to be clean." Isabel touched the brass edge of the railing. "The narrative is simple," she said. "We will show them the system." Alexandra nodded. His allegiance felt strategic and human at once. He slid a sheaf of printouts into her hand. Vendor lists, an email from a procurement officer that mentioned a shell company in passing. He had circled a few lines in red and underlined words that read like a map. "You'll need witnesses," he said, blunt as a saw. "Not just footage, people who will say what they saw without hesitation." Isabel thought of Camila and Donna Rosa. She thought of the intern who had been too shaken to speak. She thought of Luis, who had printed logs and put them into a drawer as if burying them for the future. She had begun to collect witnesses the way a librarian collects books. Careful, catalogued, with the quiet certainty that they would be needed. By the end of the week, João's rage had become a more dangerous thing. He began to bully in ways that were less visible but more destructive. He started questioning people's competence publicly to gash confidence. He asked Camilla about her future career plans during a team meeting and then offered no mentorship, only a sneer. He rewrote schedules without consulting the people affected. People found themselves agreeing to late meetings that emptied their evenings. He weaponized workloads. Then, in a moment that seemed both inevitable and sudden, he pulled out the bucket. Isabel felt the bucket's impact for what it was, an escalation, an attempt to break someone under the weight of spectacle. The water made her a living proof. It was a photograph that could not easily be edited out. It was a public act that would require a public response. After the incident, the company's formal processes began their slow, mechanical thrumming. HR opened a case file. Security logged the event. The legal team asked for statements. João walked into a meeting later that day with his head high, claiming the contempt of a man convinced he had done nothing wrong. He called the occurrence a misunderstanding in an email sent to his team with an attached calendar invite for a discussion on workplace conduct. The email read like a pill, polite and hard to swallow. Isabel knew the system would move slowly. She also knew the value of timing. A case that sits too long without resolution grows mold in corners. Employees lose faith. People tell themselves the story they prefer, that the complaint was petty, that authority must be respected. The window to act, to convince, was measured in the fragile hours when memory was sharp and alignment possible. Luis, with the printed logs and time-stamped footage, asked for a meeting with HR and with Alexandre. He asked for a secure room. He made a request in a voice that hinted at its consequence. "I have concerns about financial irregularity and about patterns of behavior that suggest misuse of authority." HR responded as HR often does. They scheduled an initial interview. They asked for documentation. Alexandre pushed for a more careful collection. He had learned the art of building cases quietly, and now he was in the middle of it. Camilla kept her phone photo in a folder named Work, Images Only. She showed it once to her sister on a quiet train commute, and watched the world widen for someone who had believed there were no allies. The sister told her to be careful. Camilla promised and felt a strange electric resolve grow. She began to keep a second list in her head, names, dates, small acts of cruelty that no official document would record. She made a decision she barely understood. She would testify if called. Donna Rosa made copies of her own notebook entries and tucked them into an envelope she labeled with a trembling hand. Support. She wrote a short note that read, "This is for the future." Then she slid it under the reception desk, where Isabel would find it later. Isabel thought of her father's face in the framed photo on the hallway table, a man who had not always been gentle, but who had always anchored his decisions to the idea of responsibility. She wondered how much of this fight was about her pledge to a memory, and how much was simply the recognition that she could not watch people be humiliated and stay idle. The water had been cruel, but it had also been a catalyst. On the edge of the next day's meeting, João's office door closed with the soft click of a man who expects the machinery of power to swallow the noise. Isabel sat at her post, towel around her shoulders, ledger open, pen poised. She watched the lobby, the way people moved, how gossip slides into routine. She listened for the sound of the building breathing, the quiet rhythms of lamps turning off, of cleaning crews folding chairs, of conversations that sound like life. She was patient by design, but not complacent. The plan was moving into its next phase: evidence assembly, witness coordination, the slow gathering of proof that would make denial harder to sustain. She had the photograph, the financial anomalies flagged by Luis, the whispered testimonies from Camila and Donna Rosa, and Alexandra's cautious but decisive support. What she did not yet have was the moment when the board and HR would be unable to look away, when the company would have to choose between protecting an abuser and protecting its workers. As the day folded into evening, Isabel saw João waving a man out of the building. He grinned with the cock of a head that says one thing: "I'm untouchable." The man left, shoulders hunched, like a person who had been told to carry the blame so the powerful could keep their shoes clean. Luis tapped his pen against a file and then looked up at Isabel. There was a long, sober exchange, a conversation of eyes. He had printed the badge swipes and the vendor records and put them in a manila folder with a simple label: preliminary. He slid it across the desk toward her, and for a moment they shared the knowledge of raw facts. "This will take time," Luis said. "We do this right, or we do it not at all." Isabel closed her hand gently around the folder. The paper felt ordinary and enormous at once. She thought about how many small acts had led to this: notes slipped into pockets, videos saved on phones, pens left on desks. She thought about how fragile courage is, and how it sometimes hides in the smallest gestures. Outside, the city lit up like a pattern of coins. Inside, the office hummed with its own life, lights in empty conference rooms like stars. The next steps required discipline, not drama. They required people willing to testify, processes that could not be gamed, and a leader willing to stand in front of the company and say what must be done. When she thought of the boardroom, she thought of chairs that, until now, had been places where men measured each other's advantages, not where they bent to repair the harm done beneath. There would be a confrontation, she knew that. The question was when, and with how much breadth of evidence. For now, they built quietly. They collected. They catalogued. That night, João locked his office, walked to his car, and counted his money in the privacy of leather seats. He did not consider the tiny, insistent ways people accumulate risk in the form of testimonies, phone photos, and notebooks. He believed in the solidity of systems he had helped navigate. He believed himself inevitable. He did not know that Donna Rosa had a small envelope tucked into her desk drawer with lines of dates and descriptions, that Camilla had a folder on her phone filled with awkwardly recorded clips, nor that Luis had printed badge swipes that, when placed next to invoices, formed a thin, worrying line. He did not know that Alexandra had circled a name and underlined a bank code in red. Isabel folded the manila folder, placed it in the bottom of her bag, and stood. Her body had felt the bucket sting for hours. Now, a different iron clamped around something like resolve. She took a breath that tasted of cold water and determination. There would be rules to follow and consequences to bear. She had chosen the painstaking path because she wanted change that would last. She left the lobby by the side door, barefoot in her scuffed flats, and went into the night that already smelled like rain. The city wrapped around her like a story that was not yet finished. Her phone vibrated with an encrypted message from Alexandra. "We have more. Tomorrow. Be ready." In the quiet of her small rented room that night, an ordinary space with a view of other people's windows, Isabel spread the ledger on the table. She wrote, slowly and clearly, as if each letter was an act of witness: date, event, witnesses, notes. Beneath her pen the entries formed a map. The map showed a path she would not rush down with the brute force of title or money. It showed instead a path of steady, stubborn proof. Outside, someone practiced an argument on the sidewalk. Inside, Isabel put the photograph of Roberto back in the corner shelf and closed her eyes for a long moment. She had learned that change is like the weather, sometimes slow in coming, sometimes violent when it arrives. She felt now, as the city breathed and the buildings slept, the weight of other people's futures on her shoulders. She had not come as a conqueror. She had come as a witness, armed with patience. The first chapter closed on the lobby, on water and eyes, and a man who thought himself untouchable. The next chapter would require witnesses who could speak without fear, evidence that could not be dismissed as coincidence, and a leadership that would choose repair over protection. Somewhere between the camera flash of a phone and the printed logs in Luis's drawer, the company moved toward a decision. The actors were in place. The crowd had seen the show. The director, Isabel, waited, not for spectacle, but for the right moment to turn the footage into truth. The next morning, the building smelled faintly of coffee and a tension that people wear like an ill-fitting coat. The rumor of the bucket had become more than gossip. It was a fact sketched into the margin of everyone's day. Isabel arrived before the elevators hummed awake, hands folded around a paper cup, towel now gone, thrift blazer still damp at the collar. She moved through the lobby with the practiced invisibility that had become her trade. Her ledger lay in her bag like a small legal instrument, evidence kept honest on paper. Alexandra had set the meeting with care. He had called it a routine leadership discussion and scheduled the boardroom at 9, a time when most directors believed the morning would still be theirs. He had asked Luis to pull the security footage into a secure drive and asked legal to reserve a council seat. He had made no proclamations, only a string of precise arrangements. The meeting notice read like corporate water, polite and designed to sound inevitable. Inside the security office, Luis moved with a kind of sorrowful efficiency. He had slept little the night since the bucket. He had printed, copied, and sealed, and then made a second set because he did not want any single stack of paper to be at risk of loss. He drew lines from timestamps to invoices, from badge swipes to bank transfers. Where there had been scattered notes, there were now arrows and totals. The numbers read differently when they were aligned, small sums that aggregated into a pattern of diversion. Luis felt a careful satisfaction, like a man folding a garment until it fit the drawer just so. He did not smile. His work was not about triumph. It was about making sure truth had a place to stand. Camilla arrived with her hands trembling, a phone in her pocket full of shaky videos. She had rehearsed what she might say if asked. The rehearsed lines were simple. The dates, the events, the feeling of being made small. She had written them down on a sticky note and tucked it into her palm like a talisman. Donna Rosa came with a folder whose corners were softened by decades of use. For her, the act of copying pages and handing them over felt like consigning a history to a ledger. She moved with the small gravity of a woman who knew the value of details. Alexandra watched them enter like someone both regretting and relieved at the gravity of what he'd summoned. He met Isabel briefly in the corridor. There was the sort of look that says, "We go in together." She nodded, the motion small and precise. The boardroom smelled of leather and citrus disinfectant. The long table gleamed with devices and calendar invites. At one end, João sat comfortably as if chairs could indicate dominion, his tie an argument in silk. He did not yet know that the game had moved out of the lobby and into a place where rules, once invoked, could not be ignored. The first act of the morning was procedural. Legal read a statement about due process and confidentiality. HR noted the complaint and the formal opening of an investigation. A junior counsel spoke about the need for evidence and the possibility of outside auditors. These were the husks of corporate response, the parts that sound safe when spoken aloud. Alexandra then asked for an executive summary from Luis. The security head stood, cleared his throat, and with a quiet that made the room lean in, laid out images and timestamps. He did not dramatize. He pointed to sequences, the lobby feed, the exact time of the bucket, The late-night badge swipes that brought João into rooms where no log of vendors existed. He matched vendor names to bank codes. He showed recordings in which João's card accessed a door labeled Accounts Archive at 2 in the morning. Luis's voice broke only once, at the memory of the arc of water, and then steadied. Isabel watched faces. The board shifted. Some drew eyebrows together, others looked at their hands as if discovering them. The evidence unfurled like a map in the middle of a table, and in that map João's lines were unexpectedly visible. When it was time for human testimony, Alexandra suggested they hear from witnesses. Camilla's steps toward the table were slow. She set her phone down and opened the gallery, placing the photo, water on Isabel's blazer, so that everyone could see the angle and the face. Her voice was thin at first, then strengthened with a clarity that surprised her. She spoke of small indignities that had cut across days, of schedules rearranged, of managers who learned to weaponize the daily routine. She spoke of the morning João had used the bucket to correct a receptionist. She said simply, "I thought that was the kind of thing that happened to people like me." Donna Rosa read from her neat transcription. Her voice had the cadence of habit rather than anger. She named dates and phrases and the people present. She did not grandstand. She offered a ledger. Her testimony had the weight of accumulated observation. João listened with the arrogance of someone who believed accusations disintegrate when measured. He shifted in his chair. Sometimes his chin lifted as if to show that nothing could touch the facts of his day. But as the evidence was placed beside testimony, as badge swipes coupled with bank transfers, and as a secretary's notebook aligned with footage timestamps, a different story formed in the air. This was not a single bad incident, but a system of petty cruelty, accompanied by plausible financial manipulation. At the table, one of the older directors, a man with a reputation for protecting his network, interrupted. He asked about motive. He tried to frame João as a performer who sometimes crossed lines but who had been a revenue driver. His question had the shape of self-preservation. Protecting reputations often protects investments. Alexandra's face did not change. He looked down at the documents and then at Isabel with a steadying comprehension that this was bigger than empires or reputations. "We are not here to defend a person," he said. "We are here to protect the company's integrity." Isabel's turn to speak arrived like a tide. She sat, fingers clasped, and when she spoke it was with a voice that was not theatrical but resolute. She did not begin with the revelation of who she was. Instead, she began with the people. Camilla's fear, Donna Rosa's ledger, Luis's files. She thanked them. She described what dignity meant in a line so simple that it landed like a bell. "Work is where we spend our lives. It should not be a place where we are made small." There was then a deliberate pause. She looked at João, not with fury, but with an examination that could be mistaken for curiosity. "My name is Isabel Silva," she said, and the tilt of every head shifted because of the cadence, not because of the content. "I am the president's daughter." Silence followed like a held breath. A few guesses drifted, an heir apparent, a niece perhaps, but Isabel did not stop there. She reached into her bag and drew out the photograph from her hallway table, one that bore the inscription, "With Father Roberto Silva." She placed it on the table, facing the board, and let the picture do what words sometimes struggle to achieve, provide a root. "I am his adopted daughter," she said, and the room rebalanced at that small, private fact, not born into the name, but brought into it by someone who had chosen responsibility. The air changed from curiosity to the operatic unspooling of a deeper truth. "I undertook this work with the agreement of my father, to understand what this company looks like from the bottom," she continued. "I have watched. I have listened. I have collected what you now have in front of you." A murmur rustled through the room that was part astonishment and part recalculation. There is a particular awkwardness when power discovers a new geometry. Titles shift like tectonic plates. João's color had changed. He had misread the audience. He had expected a complaint to be negotiated into dismissal, and he had failed to account for the owner's reach. Isabel did not gloat. Her disclosure had a purpose that was legal, moral, and public: transparency. She described the constraints she had chosen: limited access provided by Alexandre, oversight by Luis, and careful adherence to protocols. She said explicitly that she did not break into files, did not plant evidence, did not alter records. She had not used her influence to coerce testimony. The evidence before them had been collected through legitimate channels, corroborated by multiple witnesses, and now presented openly. She then presented what Luis and Alexandre had assembled: a financial dossier that showed transfers to a shell, invoices with mismatched service descriptions, reimbursement requests signed by João that lacked receipts. Alexandre narrated key lines, explaining in clear, non-technical language what discrepancies looked like, why they mattered, and what the immediate administrative remedies were. Legal counsel described the course the company must follow: suspension pending investigation, referral to external auditors, and potential involvement of law enforcement if fraud thresholds were met. João had a response. First a denial, then an attempt to pivot, and finally a strain of anger that surfaced when he realized the net was closing. He tried to frame the bucket as a misunderstanding, an ill-judged attempt at correction. He tried to bring up numbers, revenues, deals closed, hoping to remind the board of his value. He spoke of context until the boardroom felt crowded with it. People leaned back in their chairs as if the room itself had suddenly acquired ballast. Then something notable happened. A younger board member, a woman who had been silent, looked directly at João and asked, "Did you ever ask someone how it felt to be corrected with a show?" The question was small and precise. It landed. João could not answer because the footage had a stubborn clarity about it. The arc of water, the silence of witnesses, the small photographs of shame stored on phones and in memories. Legal recommended immediate suspension. The board voted in a quiet that had the intensity of finality. João's access would be revoked that day. His company credit card would be frozen pending audit. An independent investigative team would be engaged. The decision was not a blood sport. It was an administrative mechanism, temporary removal, not a lynching. João's reaction was a scramble of entitlement, pleas to resume, attempts to negotiate, an insistence that he be allowed to explain his side to a public that he imagined would listen. The company arranged for João to be escorted, not as a spectacle, but to ensure the safety of people who might have been subject to him. Luis oversaw the process with a professional's restraint. João left with his belongings in a box, his face a particular map of disbelief. Outside the room, Isabel felt a quick private grief at how long such things had to take to be right. She had expected the administrative machinery to be clumsy. She had not expected it to be indifferent. Still, the decision was a hinge. A system had chosen to act. The immediate aftermath focused on restoration. Isabel walked through the floor with a measured pace and visited the reception where the small crowd had formed like a congregation. She spoke with Camilla first, not in the grand tones of a benefactor, but with the blunt, "Are you okay? What do you need?" Camilla answered with a voice that sometimes faltered, then steadied. They talked about support, access to counseling, a temporary leave if desired, and a direct line to a new HR liaison who would be accountable to the executive office, not to João's former chain of command. Dona Rosa was invited to a small planning meeting. Isabel told her plainly that her notebook would be kept by the company as part of an archive, and that she would be asked to help design the new culture oversight process. Rosa blinked and smiled in a slow way that seemed like acceptance of something long overdue. Luis was moved into a new role in the redesign phase. He would lead an internal audit team in conjunction with the external investigators and would be asked to implement more robust badge access and CCTV oversight, subject to legal counsel on privacy and employee rights. Alexandra, who had been the thread that connected Isabel to the company's interior, was elevated in responsibility, a formal title that recognized the strategic risks he had taken to ensure proper process. Publicly, the company released a statement that admitted a formal investigation had been opened, that the company took complaints seriously, and that temporary measures were in place to protect employees while due process continued. The wording was careful and devoid of triumph. Isabel had insisted on phrasing that emphasized repair over spectacle. They offered resources for affected employees and opened a hotline that would go directly to a third-party ombudsperson to ensure anonymity and reduce fear of retaliation. There were critics. Some in the press were swift to ask why it had taken so long. Some investors worried about the optics. Isabel met with a few directors privately and explained the path chosen, not to sweep, but to build durable remedies. "We cannot simply remove a man and breathe relief," she told them. "We must change what allowed him to become dangerous in the first place." So the reforms began like careful surgery. The company contracted an external auditing firm to review the financial irregularities. It set up an independent ethics committee with an external chair and internal members including Camila and Donna Rosa as employee representatives. It created a whistleblower hotline managed by the independent firm and guaranteed anonymity with legal channels to protect those who spoke. HR was restructured to report, at least temporarily, through the independent ethics chair to avoid conflicts of interest. Mandatory training on dignity and harassment was set for all levels, and managers were given specific metrics related to team well-being as part of performance reviews. Isabel insisted on public buy-in. She hosted a town hall, open, candid, and free of corporate gloss. She did not stand on a platform and declare righteousness. Instead, she read aloud some of the ledger details with permission, asked people for their stories, and acknowledged the company's failure. She apologized on behalf of leadership, including herself, for not having seen earlier. The apology was not an absolution. It was a start. In the weeks that followed, the investigative momentum continued. External auditors found discrepancies consistent with Luis's filings and recommended further forensic review. The independent investigators recommended that certain invoices and transfers be referred to prosecutors for potential criminal investigation. The legal team coordinated with outside counsel to manage disclosures, to protect whistleblowers, and to cooperate appropriately with authorities. These were not theatrical acts. They were procedural steps designed to ensure that justice, where warranted, would be pursued within the rule of law. Isabel was careful about the narrative. She avoided using the company's power to obliterate João personally. She did not demand his public humiliation. She focused instead on protections for victims and institutional mechanisms to prevent recurrence. When news outlets demanded interviews, she selected a few trusted channels and spoke about process, accountability, and dignity. "This is not about the fall of one man," she said on a recorded segment. "It is about the redesign of a system that allowed cruelty to hide under the guise of management." Camila began to change. She moved from trembling witness to a participant in policy design. She was offered a fellowship in the new employee experience team to train managers and to design a mentorship program. Her first act was practical, a checklist for managers that included a simple line, "Has this person been heard in the last month?" designed to ensure regular human connection rather than transactional oversight. Her voice in meetings was still soft, but possessed of a new steadiness. When she spoke, people listened because she carried the specificity of lived experience. Donna Rosa became an unlikely institutional memory. She chaired a small advisory panel to archive incidents and to create a training module drawn from real-life entries she had recorded. She insisted on a small but symbolic measure, a locked-in ledger where anyone could deposit notes anonymously and where the company's ombudsperson could review patterns without fear of manipulation. She called it the House of Names, a quiet repository for the small histories that often go unnoticed. Luis, in his broadened role, redesigned badge access and created an escalation protocol for concerning behaviors. He ensured that security footage could be reviewed with proper legal oversight and that any irregularities would be cross-checked against financial logs. He pushed for an ethics liaison within the security team whose job would be to preserve evidence and protect whistleblowers' anonymity. His work made the company's systems less pliable for exploitation. Months passed in deliberate sequences. Some employees left, some stayed, and stitched their lives back into the fabric of the company. João's legal ordeal unfolded with the measured steps of the justice system. He was dismissed, of course, but dismissal alone was not the end. An independent investigation confirmed enough anomalies to justify his referral to prosecutors. The criminal process would take its own time and would be out of the company's hands. Isabel resisted the urge to celebrate that outcome publicly. She preferred to let due process proceed without spectacle. The culture work was less glamorous, the kind of slow, patient labor that is not often rewarded on quarterly reports. Isabel attended monthly meetings of the Ethics Committee and listened. She instituted a policy that no one in senior leadership could override an ethics finding without a public rationale, and she required that HR metrics be publicly published at the company's internal portal: turnover by manager, grievance resolution time, anonymized survey results. Transparency became, in effect, a governance tool. Over the course of a year, boards of managers were reshuffled. Those who had been complicit through silence found themselves asked to explain. People who had been loyal to the old ways left, and new faces arrived with a culture-first mandate. The company began to measure engagement not just through productivity, but through indicators of psychological safety. How often did employees report feeling free to speak? How quickly were grievances investigated? And did managers demonstrate accountable behavior? These metrics were not perfect, but they nudged behavior. 5 years later, the lobby looked different. The marble was polished, the lighting softer, but it was a superficial shift compared to the undercurrent of change. A plaque hung near the entrance that read, in modest lettering, "In honor of those who speak and those who listen." It was not a monument to triumph, but a daily reminder. Camilla stood one morning beneath that plaque, now head of employee experience, greeting new hires with a natural warmth that had once been too risky for her. She led a training in which managers practiced listening circles. She had changed the checklist into culture kits and made a point of visiting teams without warning to model listening. Her presence was not performative. Employees recognized a woman who had once been made small and had chosen to build something that would make others less so. Donna Rosa had passed her notebook to a digital archive, but she still kept a small leather-bound copy for the presentation room where the Ethics Committee met. She had been named the company's ombudsperson emeritus and led sessions on how to record, preserve, and support testimony. Her calm was a key resource for new HR officers who still feared the old silence. Luis oversaw both safety and an ethics compliance unit that reported to the independent chair. He moved more easily now among teams, not as a sentinel, but as a steward for lawful accountability. He had been offered a chance to run a national conference on workplace security and ethics. He declined once because the work at home needed continuity, and that decision was a measure of the company's commitment to internal change. Alexandra had become Chief Operating Officer, a role that allowed him to shape the cadence of executive action without theatrics. He ensured that windows into the company's processes remained open. His loyalty to transparent governance had been rewarded not with celebrity, but with structural changes that now outlived any individual. Isabel, meanwhile, had chosen a leadership style that refused the glamour of omnipotence and instead preferred proximity. She did not hide her identity anymore. She did not need to. She walked the floor without the need for a towel or a thrift blazer. She preferred to meet with small groups and to let policies stand on their own. The title she held bore a different weight, not merely wealth or power, but custodianship. She set her office lights to go out at the same time as the teams she visited, a small, purposeful action that signaled she was not above the rhythms she had asked others to change. The company's public story became one of incremental repair. Employees were asked to share their experiences in internal forums, and the leadership responded with data, incidents reported, resolutions delivered, days saved from harassment, the number of managers retrained. These were not empty numbers, they were accountability tools. Shareholders eventually noted a correlation between improved employee satisfaction and long-term performance. The narrative of human dignity was, ironically, also a narrative of resilience and sustainable operation. Not everything was fixed. People still left. Old habits lingered at the edges. The national press still returned now and then to the episode of the bucket and to João's slow legal decline, but the company no longer pretended that a single firing would solve structural rot. It had built systems that made it easier for people to be heard and for abuses to be investigated without fear. Isabel kept a small shelf for the things that tethered her. The photograph of Roberto, a small notebook with names of committees, and a single index card on which she had once written, "See the room, not the chair." She looked at that card often, not as a boast, but as a promise she rehearsed daily. One afternoon, 5 years after the bucket, Isabel walked into a crowded cafeteria. People smiled and greeted each other like neighbors. She spotted a junior analyst who had once left the room humiliated and who now led a small code review group. He waved her over and thanked her for the mentorship program. She accepted the thanks with a simple line, "Keep the door open." It was the kind of phrase that does not fix everything, but it does invite a continuation of care. At the annual general meeting that year, a shareholder rose and asked about the company's culture metrics. Isabel answered directly, transparent data, independent oversight, and a refusal to let history repeat itself. She also introduced 3 new hires whose names appeared on the governance chart: Camila as Chief People Officer, Dona Rosa as Head of Employee Archives and Ombud Services, and Luis as Chief Security and Ethics Officer. Alexandra stood to the side, smiling in the quiet way of someone whose work was the architecture of others' trust. After the meeting, a young woman approached Isabel and told her quietly about a supervisor who still made jokes at meetings. She handed Isabel a small note, dates, times, a voice recording. The gesture felt like something circular, a problem handing itself forward to someone who had taught others what to look for. Isabel thanked her and asked her to file it through the independent hotline. She had learned that systems only endure if people keep using them. The company had, in 5 years, shifted its posture from denial to repair. It had not become perfect. What it had done was make a structural choice to value people's dignity as a measurable output. That choice had consequences beyond the lobby. Competitors invited their HR leads to joint seminars. Industry groups sought advice on building whistleblower protections that worked. The firm became a modest reference in conversations about ethics, not because it had never failed again, but because it had demonstrated perseverance. Isabel often thought of Roberto. She had inherited not just wealth, but a sense of obligation. The adoption had been a human story, a man who chose a child and then insisted that wealth come with duty. Roberto's teaching had been blunt at times and quietly wise in others. Power must build, not break. Isabel had chosen to honor that lesson in the slow work of being accountable. In quieter moments, she would take out her ledger, now an institutional artifact, and read entries that had once hurt to write. She kept them not to relive the pain, but to remember the people who had brought truth forward. She kept a photograph of the lobby that included the plaque, small, modest letters that nearby employees passed every day. Sometimes she stood there in the morning and watched the flow of people and the small courtesies exchanged at the reception desk, gestures that had once felt rare and were now ordinary. The memory of the bucket never entirely left. Trauma tends to be stubborn, but it lost its capacity to be the story's end. It became instead a hinge point, the moment that forced a company to choose. That choice rippled outward. Policy changes at partner firms, conversations among industry leaders about accountability, and, most importantly, the daily lives of people who now felt less alone when speaking up. One evening, when Isabel walked into the lobby and saw Camilla holding a new hire's hand through a sign-in process, she smiled in the private recognition of people who have been changed by what they endured. She reached into her pocket and touched the edge of the photo on her phone, the one of Roberto with his laugh lines, and felt grateful not for wealth, but for the impetus that had pushed her toward responsibility. She never took revenge. In public, she remained quiet about João's fate, beyond confirming that the company would cooperate with legal authorities. The work she did was not to break a man, but to fix the conditions that had allowed him to harm. That distinction, she believed, was the core of leadership worth cultivating. At the end of another ordinary day in a place that no longer tolerated spectacle, Isabel passed the plaque and read its simple words. She thought of people who come to work in good faith, expecting to be seen for their contributions, not overlooked because of their clothes or their name. She thought of small acts, notes tucked in pockets, a pen picked up, a photograph taken on a phone, that turned into the scaffolding of truth. As she reached the glass doors, she paused and looked back at the lobby, where employees walked with a quietness that felt contained and strong. The building no longer felt like a theater of power, but a place where duties were taken seriously. She took a breath, not of triumph, but of responsibility kept, and stepped out into the evening air. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who cares about workplaces where dignity matters, and tell us in the comments a time you saw courage in the small things.